Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn believe that there is a learning revolution underway due to a confluence of forces, and they name these forces as urgency, knowledge, and capacity. The urgency stems from the dynamic, fast-paced, multimedia global world competing with traditional schooling. The second force for change is the emerging knowledge base in both pedagogy and change leadership. The third force, capacity, raises the question, how do we mobilize to innovate in a sustainable way? Well, Fullan and Quinn suggest that we need to focus on two critical notions. First of all, they posit we must shift from a focus on teaching or inputs to a deeper understanding of learning and how we can influence it. And next, they call for a relentless focus. That means we need to abandon the notion that there's a silver bullet or a packaged program that's a solution, and recognize that the next shift in learning will require knowledge building by everyone engaged, and it must affect all students. All of that leads us to deepening learning, which is the third component of the Coherence framework, and this component addresses the relationship of pedagogy and technology. Fullan and Quinn suggest that if we want students who can thrive in complex, turbulent times, apply thinking to new situations, and change the world, we have to reimagine learning. What's important to learn, how learning is fostered, where learning occurs, and how we measure new outcomes. They call this new conceptualization deep learning, and it's spreading rapidly because it's meaningful, gives purpose, and unleashes potential. Fullan and Quinn believe there are three elements that deepen learning: establishing the clarity for deep learning goals, building precision in pedagogies accelerated by digital, and shifting practices through capacity building. They believe that if we want to mobilize concerted action and a deep shift in practice, then we need to develop a clarity of outcomes, build shared understanding across educators, students, parents, all of the community. In this vein, they have established a global partnership that's entitled New Pedagogies for Deep Learning. You can investigate their website and browse through there. It's overwhelming. The first step in building precision and consistent practices is to be clear about the learning goals. Fullan and Quinn posit that for the last quarter of century, education has been giving rather superficial lip service to this topic of 21st century skills, without much action and very little impact. New Pedagogies for Deep Learning is leading the charge in developing clarity of outcomes. This is actually a global partnership that is working to define with specificity 6 deep learning competencies, also known as the 6 C's, to describe what learning would look like for each of these, to identify pedagogies that fosters these competencies, and to design measures to assess students' progress in developing these competencies. The 6 deep learning competencies are displayed on this slide. Communication is described as coherent communication using a range of modes, communication designed for different audiences, substantive and multimodal communication, as well as reflection on and use of the process of learning to improve communication. In terms of critical thinking, it's described as evaluating information and arguments, making connections and identifying patterns, problem solving, meaningful knowledge construction, and then experimenting, reflecting, and taking action on ideas in the real world. Collaboration is described as working interdependently as a team, interpersonal and team-related skills, social, emotional, and intercultural skills, as well as the management of team dynamics and challenges. Creativity is described as the economic and social entrepreneurialism, asking the right inquiry questions, considering and pursuing novel ideas and solutions, as well as leadership for action. Character, in this sense, is described as learning to learn. They address terms such as grit, tenacity, perseverance, and resilience, also self-regulation and responsibility, as well as empathy for and contributing to the safety and benefit of others. Finally, citizenship is described as a global perspective, understanding of diverse values and worldviews, a genuine interest in human and environmental sustainability, as well as solving ambiguous, complex, and authentic problems. The overall purpose of the 6 C's is the well-being of the whole student, but also the well-being of the group and the society as a whole. In essence, learning becomes the development of competencies for the successful negotiation of an uncertain world. I invite you to click on this link on the slide. It's a very short video featuring Dr. Michael Fullan, where he does expand a little bit more on the 6 C's of deep learning. In their research and work with the new pedagogies for deep learning, Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn have identified 3 strands of expertise that teachers need to weave together if they are going to support deeper learning. These include precision in pedagogical partnerships that engage students in co-designing authentic, relevant learning, learning environments that foster risk-taking and 24/7 connections, as well as leveraging digital so that it accelerates learning. The first strand recognizes that teachers must possess deep expertise in instructional and assessment practices if they are to maximize the impact and use of digital to accelerate learning. Fullan and Quinn emphasize that new pedagogies build on the foundation of proven pedagogical practices. However, it fuses them with emerging innovative practices that foster creation and application of new ideas and knowledge in real-world situations. They note that educators must hone a deep knowledge of the learning process and a repertoire of strategies if they are to use digital as an accelerator. The magic, they say, is not in the device, but in the use of the device to scaffold experiences and challenges that are finely tuned to the needs and interests of students, and thereby maximizing through relevance, authenticity, and real-world connections. Fullan and Quinn say the first step in building precision in pedagogical practices begins with a culture that fosters learning for all. They suggest that if adults are not thinking at high levels, it is very unlikely that students will be either. They also suggest that schools and districts want to build a common language and a knowledge base so that they can delve into perhaps the work of John Hattie in visible learning. Hattie reviews the impact of instructional strategies, and he concluded that what is needed to raise the bar and close the gap is consensus and skill development by all teachers engaged with a group of students around impactful strategies. Hattie's research found that teachers as facilitators has only a 0.17 impact on learning, while teachers as activators has a much more powerful impact of 0.87. He also uncovered a number of notable high-impact strategies that an activator would have in his or her repertoire. For instance, cognitive task analysis came in at 0.87. Giving feedback came in at 0.75. Teacher-student relationships at 0.72. And student expectations at 1.44. Now, John Hattie notes that 2 very underused strategies with tremendous power are giving feedback and student expectations. He reports that on average, students get 3 to 5 seconds of precise feedback per day. However, what they need is feedback that helps them to set the next challenge for their learning and the one after that. Hattie makes a distinction between strategies that are appropriate for shallow learning versus deep learning. Shallow learning is defined not as trivial or less important, but learning that is essential to understand the content and develop basic skills. Shallow learning then becomes a foundation for deeper learning. Deeper learning is the ability to understand concepts, think critically, solve problems, and apply learning in authentic ways. Strategies for deep learning would include, for example, inquiry, problem-based learning, and knowledge production. Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn expand the conversation to note that new pedagogies go deeper than changing the pedagogy between student and teacher. They actually explore more deeply new roles for students, such as student to student, student to teacher, and student to the external world. This shift towards active learning partnerships requires students to take greater charge of their own and each other's learning, both inside and outside of the classroom. This exciting possibility has the potential to create more authentic and meaningful learning, both locally, nationally, and even globally. Fullan and Quinn argue that this shift is inevitable because, 1, students are no longer to be willing passive recipients of learning as defined by someone else. 2, they are digitally connected to massive amounts of new ideas and information. And 3, they do respond to traditional didactic approaches, basically with passivity, once they have the foundational skills in place. Fullan and Quinn state the importance of teachers understanding the 3 elements of the student learning model depicted on this slide. My learning, the first element, refers to the need for students to take responsibility for their learning and to understand the process of learning. This requires that students develop skills in learning to learn, which means they build metacognition on their own learning, define their own learning goals and success criteria, monitor their own learning and critically examine their own work, incorporate feedback from peers, teachers, and others to deepen their awareness of how they function in the learning process. It also involves giving and receiving feedback. Feedback is essential to improving performance, and as students make progress in mastering the learning process, the role of the teacher gradually shifts from explicitly structuring the learning task to providing feedback, activating the next learning challenge, and continuously developing the learning environment. Enacting student agency means that students take a more active role in co-developing learning tasks as well as assessing the results. It is more than a mere participation. It is engaging students in real decision-making and a willingness to learn together. The second element, my belonging, is a crucial foundation for all human beings who are social by nature and crave purpose, meaning, and connectedness to others. Here we are looking at caring environments that will help students to flourish and meet the basic need of all humans, which is to feel they are respected and that they belong. And then also relationships, which are integral for preparing for authentic learning. As students develop both interpersonal connections and intrapersonal insight, they are able to move more successfully to more complex tasks, both in groups and independently. They can also manage collaborative relationships and begin self-monitoring, which are skills for life. The final element, my aspiration, focuses on the fact that student results can be dramatically affected by the expectations they hold of themselves and the perceptions they believe others have for them. John Hattie's research noted that expectations are a key determinant of success. Students must believe they can achieve and also feel that others believe that. Students need to co-determine success criteria and be engaged in measuring their own growth. Needs and interests are a powerful accelerator for motivation and engagement, and teachers who tap into the natural curiosity and interests of students are able to use that as a springboard to deeply engage students in tasks that are relevant, authentic, and examine concepts and problems in depth. The link on this page will take you to a brief introduction to the W.G. Davis Middle School in Ontario. This is a place where students were disengaged, disruptive behaviors were on the rise, and achievement was dropping. The principal and staff collaborated over several months to find solutions and eventually determined that students needed better role models and the kind of digital engagement that they valued outside of the school building. The staff also realized that they were the ones who had to become the role models for their students, and thus they began a process of implementing more authentic learning using problem-based units that crossed the traditional content boundaries and implemented what they called at the time a BYOD, bring your own device policy. Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn posit that the second strand that fosters transformation to deep learning is a shift in the learning environment. They suggest that quality learning environments that use pedagogical practices and build the learning partnerships they've described really need to meet 4 basic criteria. 1, they need to be irresistibly engaging for students and teachers. 2, they need to allow 24/7 access to learning. 3, they need to cultivate social learning. And 4, they need to foster risk-taking and innovation. While both Fullan and Quinn admit there is no one recipe for creating classrooms that provoke deep learning, they have noticed that among early innovators they've found common characteristics. For instance, in these situations, students ask questions. In these classrooms, students have the skills and language to pursue inquiry and are not passively taking in answers from teachers. In these situations, questions are valued above answers. The process of learning and discovering and conveying is as important as the end result. There are varied models for learning. The selection of approaches is matched to the students, to the needs, and the interests. Students are supported to reach for the next challenge, constantly moving forward. Explicit connections are made to real-world application, so learning designs are not left to chance, but they are scaffolded and built on relevance and meaning. Collaboration is in place. Students possess skills to collaborate within the classroom and beyond. Assessment of learning is also embedded, transparent, and authentic. Students define their personal goals, monitor their progress towards success criteria, and engage in feedback with peers and others. Fullan and Quinn believe that these criteria will create learning environments where all students can flourish. The third strand of deep learning as a trio is leveraging digital. Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn have purposely moved away from the term technology to signal really that this discussion is not about devices, but it is about the learning that can be amplified, accelerated, and facilitated by interaction with the digital world. It is not about putting a device in front of every student and leaving them to learn independently, which really would pose the danger of students becoming digital isolates. It is about bringing the digital world inside the process of learning and building collaboration within and outside the classroom in ways that are authentic and relevant. Alan November, a pioneer in the meaningful use of technology, describes this new view as transforming learning beyond the $1,000 pencil. He notes that students must be taught how to use technology appropriately, safely, and ethically to gain an understanding at the highest levels of Bloom's taxonomies or the depth of knowledge. In his book, Who Owns the Learning?, Alan November challenges educators to ask themselves the questions on this slide to determine if they are getting beyond the superficial use of the digital. The ultimate challenge is for leaders to help educators move from uses of technology as a substitution to uses of digital that provide value. For example, if I'm a student studying a unit on poverty and I use technology to create a PowerPoint instead of handwriting a report, there may be very little value added. In contrast, however, if I interview 4 people in global communities who are living in poverty, synthesize that information, and create my report, there has been tremendous value added through the layers of critical thinking, communication, character, and global citizenship. I would ask you to please click on the link on this slide. It will take you to New Pedagogies Deep Learning, a particular page on that site that features a number of short videos with examples of new pedagogies and actions. I would encourage you to click through and examine a few of them just to look at some of the samples of what's being taken care of through this partnership. Once schools and districts have clarified learning goals and developed precision in pedagogical practices, they need to identify the processes that will support a shift in practice for all educators. In districts that are making progress in this direction, superintendents and principals shift behaviors on a large scale when they model being lead learners. For example, they don't send people to capacity building sessions, but they attend and learn alongside them. They shape a culture that fosters an expectation of learning for everyone. This culture supports taking risks and making mistakes, but learning from them. They build capacity vertically and horizontally in the entire organization with persistence and single-mindedness. So how do schools and districts tackle this shift to deep learning? Well, Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn suggest that the first step in making a change is to assess the starting point. They offer the questions on this slide for reflection on your school and district and its capacity to shift practices. Fullan and Quinn offer the example of a school that was able to engage an underperforming student population with dramatic results using pedagogical precision and capacity building. In 2007, the Cochrane Collegiate Academy in Charlotte, North Carolina was listed as one of the 30 lowest performing schools in North Carolina. However, by 2011, the number of students performing at grade level had doubled, and the achievement gap had actually been reduced by 35% in both reading and math. Most notable was that their growth was 3.5 times that of North Carolina in math and twice the rate of growth in reading. Now, Cochrane Collegiate Academy serves a population of about 640 students in grades 6 to 8. 87% qualify for free or reduced lunch, 60% are African American, 30% are Latino. The link on this page will take you to a series of video clips that illustrate the original conditions and the progress at the school. The staff at Cochrane attributed their success to a principal who brought out their potential by using the 5 key components on this slide. Now, guided by research, they identified their top 10 teaching practices and engaged weekly in professional learning to help them implement the practices more effectively. Their non-negotiable list of strategies included essential questions, activating strategies, relevant vocabulary, limited lecture, graphic organizers, student movement, high-order thinking questions, summarizing, rigor, and student-centeredness. Now, Fullan and Quinn suggest that what differentiates this school is not necessarily the top 10 instructional strategies they select, but the fact that they built a common language, a common knowledge base, and a set of practices around quality teaching and learning. Strong professional relationships, collaborative work, and learning partnerships with students are making a difference, and they have placed this school community on a trajectory for success. The fourth and final component of the Coherence framework is securing accountability. Now, Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn argue that if we are to achieve effective accountability, we need to develop conditions that maximize internal accountability, those conditions that increase the likelihood that people will be accountable to themselves and the group. And then next, we need to frame and reinforce internal accountability with external accountability, the standards, expectations, transparent data, and selective interventions. Simply stated, accountability is taking responsibility for one's actions. At the core of accountability in education is student learning. Constantly improving and refining instructional practice so that students can engage in deep learning tasks is perhaps the single most important responsibility of the teaching profession and the educational system. In that sense, Fullan and Quinn define accountability as not limited to mere gains in test scores, but on deeper, more meaningful learning for all students. Fullan and Quinn suggest that internal accountability occurs when individuals and groups willingly take on personal, professional, and collective responsibility for continuous improvement and success for all students. Now, they suggest that to strengthen internal accountability, we need to consider a few components: a small number of ambitious goals and processes that foster shared goals, good data that are used primarily for developmental purposes, implementation strategies that are transparent, whereby people and organizations are grouped to learn from each other. We're getting back to that, use the group to change the group. And then an examination of progress in order to problem solve for greater performance. Fullan and Quinn argue that the priority for policymakers should be to lead with creating the conditions for internal accountability, because they are more effective in achieving greater overall accountability, including external accountability. And research suggests that internal accountability must precede external accountability if lasting improvement in student achievement is the ultimate goal. Richard Elmore's research found that the main feature of successful schools was that they built a collaborative culture that combined individual responsibility, collective expectations, and corrective actions. He's describing internal accountability. Now on to external accountability. This is when system leaders reassure the public through transparency, monitoring, and selective intervention that their system is performing in line with the societal expectations and requirements. With strong internal accountability serving as the context, external accountability role then includes establishing and promoting professional standards and practices, ongoing monitoring of the performance of the system, insisting on reciprocal accountability that manages up as well as down, and adopting and applying indicators of organizational health. Now, Fullan and Quinn believe that it is essential to engage the external policy and accountability system. They feel we need to really seriously take state vision within our view, track our progress relative to state goals and to other districts and schools. They suggest that a good basic way to address the outside is to participate, to be a part of the networks, to present and attend at state and regional conferences. As leaders, we can contribute to the betterment of the overall system if we are plugged in to what's happening externally. You may be already familiar with the 7 competencies for highly effective leaders that was published by Kurtman and Fullan. These 7 competencies actually map very nicely onto the Coherence framework. Challenging the status quo, for instance, is really part and parcel of focusing new directions. Building trust through clear communication and expectations, as well as creating a commonly owned plan for success, are part of collaborating with purpose. Focusing on team over self is, of course, about developing leadership in others. High sense of urgency for change and sustainable results, along with a commitment to continuous improvement, these relate to the internal and external accountability. Building external networks and partnerships is really a wraparound set of collaborative activities that enable leaders to use both and contribute to the external environment. Mastering the change process in the Coherence framework is not easy, but we don't have to go on this journey alone. Developing leaders at all levels will be essential to distributing the work. One of the marks of an effective leader is not only the impact that they have on the bottom line of student achievement, but also equally how many good leaders they leave behind. Effective leaders choose, mentor, and otherwise develop other leaders. Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn posit that this has 2 payoffs. In the short run, there is more impact because of a critical mass of leaders who are working in a focused way on the same agenda. In the long term, the impact is even more powerful because these leaders form a critical mass of leaders for the next phase. In other words, junior members of a learning organization are being groomed for the future as they get better in the present. Effective leaders develop teams of leaders, and consequently, if they are successful, they become more dispensable to their organization because they've developed a cadre of other leaders who will carry on and go deeper. Whereas if the individual leader is dominant, they leave a vacuum when they depart. Even if they have been successful, their impact is superficial because too much depends on them as an individual. So ironically, the goal is to make yourself dispensable as a leader so that you and your organization can go on to further progress.